Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about managed security services. We touched a little bit on this a couple episodes ago when we were looking at security aspects of the MCP. And with me to discuss it is Scott Crawford, who heads our information security practice, and Greg Zwakman, who heads our market monitor team. Welcome back to the podcast to you both.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Thanks, Eric. Always a pleasure to be back this time.
Well, I guess to begin with, maybe, Scott, if you can go into a little background, what this market is all about, and if we think about managed security services, what's really happened in this area, and really what's the lay of the land in terms of security capabilities?
So managed security services has been part of the cybersecurity market for pretty much as long as there has been a cybersecurity market. It's a market where tools emerge more or less constantly. We have a number of functional segments to the market, new types of tools for new types of threats, new types of exposures in an environment. The market has grown up along the lines of security in the network, security for applications, security for data, security for endpoints, and so on. And within those large groups, there are individual segments of technology to the point that we now have thousands of vendors in cybersecurity, and it's a lot for organizations to manage, and generally has been throughout the evolution of the field. One of the things that distinguishes security from other markets is that it's not just our competitors, or it's not just new product ideas that we can move to as sort of static objectives. Adversaries are constantly moving the objectives for us, and vice versa. We're constantly moving the objectives for them as defenses increase. So this is one reason why we have so many segments and tools, and one reason why it's difficult for organizations to keep up with. So managed security services always been a substantial part of the cybersecurity market overall. And there have been some interesting changes in the managed security services market as well, going back to at least the last decade or thereabouts. We began to see the rise of technologies that did a more specific job around securing endpoints in the enterprise. And typically we meant by that individual workstations, laptops, desktops, and so on, mobile devices as well too, the things that are in the hands of individual people. I would say users, but that's my favorite Edward Tufte quote is the drug dealers and IT are the only industries that refer to people as users. So I try to think of them as people.
Well, but it does speak to what is that path for dealing with complexity in an area that, if we think about all the other aspects of IT, security has got a level of complexity and expertise in which you don't typically come across in other aspects of IT infrastructure more broadly.
Right.
And it's something where it's a set of skills you have to keep sharp. As you were pointing out, a lot of different vendors. And in fact, as we've identified in previous podcasts, I know with Brendan Daly talking about some of the various markets and the startup ecosystems that are there, the fact that there is so much investment money that seems to be keeping this a very rich and flourishing population of companies that are out there for your average enterprise, keeping their arms around this and staying sharp enough to be at least matching their adversaries is no mean feat.
Yeah, and you have to. It's not an optional thing. And that's one of the dilemmas in the space as well, too, is qualifying and, to the extent that you can, quantifying success in cybersecurity. So this is one of the things where, have service providers that you can refer. It's not always outsourcing. It's often co-managing with your own team, your investments. But having said what, it's not optional. You're facing these adversaries, and, regulators have become even more emphatic about holding organizations' feet to the fire as far as how you're doing on cybersecurity. Public companies are subjected to this now with incidents with respect to SEC regulations and so on. So yeah, it's not optional, but it's very challenging. And the expertise required to do this effectively and efficiently is something that really drives this market a lot.
Well, and I guess we've been looking at the markets, their positions, and some of the growth in this market for a considerable period of time. Greg, you chair the market monitor in security. What are you seeing in the markets, and how have they been developing?
Yeah, so we have tracked this for several years, right? I would say maybe over a decade now. We've looked at basically MSSP, and it's just been interesting to see how, again, particularly the vendor landscape has really evolved, right? Again, way back in the day, you're looking at, the core MSSPs, right? Delivering core, again, technology solutions. Now, the landscape is just, again, evolving. It's highly fragmented. It's the overall scope's gone well, again, beyond, again, traditional MSSPs in terms of companies participating in this market. Companies that are niche players focused on one component, again, specialized companies again, two different things. I know we'll talk about this down the road here, but focusing on different market segments, right? Different company sizes and different kind of vertical markets. So there's a lot at play within this market. Now, summing it up, we're tracking roughly 1,000 individual MSSPs, right? We think that number is closer to over 2,000. Our challenge is to validate these numbers to get them into our models. We look at every company, we build a model on every company. That's how we actually put together our forecasts. So right now with an MSSP, it's a pretty big market. Roughly 2024, we're just under 25 billion, right? And so right now our market that we're basically refreshing right now, so these numbers are going to change a bit, but 2028 we had a roughly 35 billion, maybe getting closer to under 40 billion once we actually extend that forecast. And that's a forecast that's, again, roughly 11%, right? So it's a big market, double-digit forecast. The segment that we do break into, again, MDR, I know we'll probably cover in more detail as well, so I won't go into too much here, but that's growing smaller. It's probably 15%, right? So we're looking at roughly 3.5 billion in 2024. That'll probably go to just under 10, right? Closer to 10. So we're looking at, again, growth in the double-digit range through 2029, not double digit, in the 20% 20% CAGR range through 2029. So just one of those offshoots that we're seeing a lot of strength, a lot of overall again, interest in terms of the overall pain points. That was pretty high, right? In the last vote survey, we have so much vote survey on this space, right? Again, Dan Kenny does a great job running that program where we can really tie a lot of our forecast to where are the pain points from the end users, right? Who's actually deploying this? Where do they see strength? Where do they see growth? And that's what we can have play within our forecast. So it's a very, very valuable tool for us. But I would just say that every time we refresh this, we're adding, at times hundreds of different vendors, right? Doing different things that we're finding. And it's really, again, providing this kind of rich, diverse, interesting, fragmented vendor landscape where you not just have one kind of monolithic MSSP category. You have all these companies doing interesting things, going to market different ways. And it's very interesting to track in terms of a data standpoint.
Well, you raise a really important point, which is that it's the managed security software environment is not any one thing. It is so many different components. You've got individual suppliers who are looking, or individual providers who are looking to be able to address different markets. Are they looking for large enterprises? Are they looking for small and mid-sized businesses? Are they, if you look at the early days, I mean, this is a business that started out back in the day that, hey, we'll manage your firewall for you. We'll manage some of the very simple parts of your infrastructure. To now, if you look at managed detection and response, MDR, here we're looking at tracking what's taking place, attacks that are happening, and then the actual response of that as well as part of that entire package. So a relatively complex world in which to slice and dice what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that arose in the first place as well, too, because you would think that, detecting attacks or attack attempts would be job number one for anyone, an internal security organization or a third-party service provider as well, too. But as you mentioned, there's just the sheer profusion of products, all of them requiring management. That's really kind of where the business started in a lot of cases. You and I both know this because of prior, a past history we've had with network security devices and managed devices as a managed services business in its own right. But about a decade ago, we started seeing the rise of endpoint detection and response, which looks at, the evidence that can be collected from those individual endpoints, which is often where attacks gain an initial foothold in an organization. and being able to analyze those, identify the emergence of a potential threat, mitigate it to the extent that you can, and respond to the incident as it goes along. One of the daunting things about that is, how many endpoints are we talking about in an enterprise? Thousands? Yeah, if you have 30,000 employees in your enterprise, how many endpoints is that per person? So yeah, the volume of data, for one thing, was really large. And so the vendors that focused on this had to specialize on what are the most meaningful aspects of telemetry that can contribute to this. So that expertise was needed. Gathering that telemetry expertise is needed. Doing, the data intake, making sure you have the proper data that's giving you the best results, correlation and analytics, all of that expertise that really was very nascent in the market about a decade ago, and only the providers themselves really had the hands-on experience with it. So that's managed detection and response kind of became more, gained a lot of momentum in this sort of almost hockey stick sort of adoption phase over the ensuing several years. And now it's still become, Greg, I think your metric is like 2x the broader MSSP market.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's become a very big, important aspect of the market. And one of the interesting bits of color on that space is now we're seeing the technology vendors themselves offering managed detection and response services, and not always just for their own technology, to support whatever the customer has if they want to use it. So the line between product provider and service provider are getting blurred in that space as well right now.
Oh, which makes some level of sense if you think about it. I've bought this particular product. It's wonderful and capable, but maybe it's more complicated, or the nuances of which I don't fully understand. Can you run it for me? Winds up being that next question, which seems, to your point, it blurs the line even further. Who is the provider? Is it a vendor? Is it, what is that next step? That starts making things a little complicated, at least in trying to break down the market itself.
Yes, absolutely. Now you're basically speaking my language, right? And this is where every time we refresh, we're adding so many different companies, because again, there's this companies coming out of the woodwork, really providing it, like you say, for their own products and services. But if they're basically expanding the scope there, they're included. They're an MSSP. So that's what we have to look at and really kind of ensure that we're including the right companies doing the right things.
Well, and the reverse is also true. We're seeing combinations. There's merger and acquisition activity that rolls that the other way around. We just had Zscaler acquiring Red Canary. Suddenly you've got someone who's, an overarching connectivity provider actually looking at managed security services as part of their portfolio.
Yeah, a lot of interesting activity kind of across the board there. That was one of them. And the interesting thing about that is that, Zscaler being primarily a SaaS provider of predominantly network security, connectivity, access control, and security for widely distributed connectivity, acquiring what's fundamentally a services play. And one of the key factors there was the investment that's increasingly being made in automation, more sophisticated and intelligent automation, directionally towards more implementations of agentic AI to see where that can yield benefit in managed security services. And that's sort of the idea of software, services delivered as software basically kind of begins to take hold. We see some examples of that with that deal in particular. We've also seen some interesting activity around, the telcos have been, if not entirely divesting their managed security businesses, taking an interesting approach to it, as with AT&T going into a joint venture with Willjam, with AT&T Cybersecurity, now branded Level Blue, and then recently themselves acquiring not only the Strauss-Friedberg group from Aon, the insurance broker, but most recently Trustwave, a former competitor in that space as well. Sophos acquiring SecureWorks, one of the best known and larger MSSP providers, but also picking up specific assets in MDR, in regional MDR in particular. So yeah, some interesting deals shaping the market going forward.
Well, you talked about this dynamic, which I think is the interesting aspect that's going on, which was in the early days, it was enterprises saying, I have all this collection of stuff. Can you run it for me? Standalone providers that were basically building their services on top of vendor products, and maybe they were actually assembling a collection of products to build the services they were putting together. Sometimes they were homegrown environments. But now, as we've shifted, there's been the discussion around the platformization of security, like platformization of a lot of stuff. That shift towards individual vendors wanting to be the platform that does it all. Well, of course, you still have to have someone to run all this. So now you've got the services that have to be wrapped around it, which seems to have brought us all the way around to the other side of this conversation, which is now those that are going out and actually starting to bring in managed service capabilities and security and roll this together to be that much larger whole. Wow, this is not just a complicated environment. Now it is one that starts to bring some interesting questions about, where's the cart, where's the horse? Is this the products that are driving the capabilities? Is this the needs that are building the services? You mentioned, service as software. This is something that now, if we look at how much is embodied into the software aspects itself, do you have to have a product that is capable of managing all of this? Oh, and you mentioned a little AI sprinkled on top of this. Maybe that starts to be a big motivator in terms of bringing all these capabilities together so that you can start to leverage AI and all the benefits that AI can bring to the table.
Yeah, case in point, one of our survey findings every year is we ask organizations in our SecOps survey, what percentage of alerts are you not able to address in a typical day in your SOC? And the number of respondents reporting they can't get to more than half has varied between 40 and 60% over the last, I think, 5 years, something like that. It's still north of 40%. So that's a pretty significant number. There's a lot of reasons for that.
It's a scary number, but it's also one that I think anybody in the business will sagely nod their heads about, because this has been one of those things that's been a truth throughout, which is we've just got so much stuff whizzing by. We'd like to be able to do more, but there are finite limits in terms of people and technology to be able to handle it.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons for that number, for sure. I mean, the explosion in cloud assets, and they all generate a lot of data individually, and that adds up, of course. But there's also the issue of, okay, how do you prep your data before on ingest, and once you've taken it in, and how do you perform correlation to get the most use out of that data? If people aren't conditioning their data before it's taken in, if they're not managing it intelligently, then there's going to be a lot of junk in that data that may overwhelm you with noise, quite frankly.
A lot of false alarms, a lot of stuff that looks like it might be bad, but we don't have enough context to understand how bad it is, and you have to pull a human in. But AI will fix all that, right?
If it has the right tools to work with. There's this, there's this school of thought around this now beginning to emerge around this concept of sec data ops. And, having a body of expertise around not just gathering the telemetry, but doing those things to make that data. You can't have a successful deployment of AI unless it has data that it can actually work with. So before you can realize those benefits from, innovative technology, it has to have the right raw materials to work with. And that in itself is a body of expertise, and is one of the things that, MDR providers and MSSPs can provide as part of the services they offer. So the tools are competent and capable. We've seen that in their evolution, but the use of them still requires a level of expertise in order to know how to get the most out of them.
All too true. So where is this headed? I guess we've been talking about the evolution, about the integration of more sophisticated capabilities like managed detection and response. Where does this head towards? And do we see simplification because of AI? Do we see complexity because of AI? And what does this do towards this market in general? Does suddenly everybody have the ability with enough horsepower to manage a lot of their own environment? Or are we still in a world in which this is still very specialized?
Boy, there have been some very buzzy concepts that have floated around, not just this market, but also the detection and response technology market itself. We've had this idea of the quote unquote autonomous SOC for several years. The idea that, the ability to detect and respond to security issues should be more automated, could be better automated than it is. And that part is undoubtedly true. The idea that it will be, a black box at some point, that's still very aspirational. But
Dave,
making moves.
I can't let you do that, Dave.
That is not an attack, Dave. That was us. But there's, directionally with that's the direction we want to head, but we're making initial steps in it at this point. I mean, we talked on the last Next in Tech about the growing approach to more sophisticated architectures for intelligent automation making use of AI to do these things. But the more complex these workflows become, the more they're going to require additional supporting structures like management specifications, MCP, to name one. The structure and architecture for agents to manage all this being another. We've seen some interesting applications of this. I mean, you could apply this to just the sheer volume of data that has to be addressed. That would make a big improvement over what people can do on their own. But also things like, you have an incident that you need to investigate. Did this person were they in Albuquerque when they logged in? Do they really need access to this resource? Did they access this resource that they don't normally do? Some of that would be evident in behavioral analytics, but there may be an exception. It may be a legitimate exception. You do have to investigate and find those things out. So you could send an agent to basically interview people involved in these types of issues and gather that context and gather richer context on incident investigation than you could do with just a sheer army of people at this point. Just one example where it's not just automated data intake, automated ETL, automated correlation, and so on.
Something that goes beyond, because behavioral analytics we've done for a really long time. And I guess this is one of the things that is challenging in security broadly. We've been touting the benefits of some level of AI in quotation marks, and whether or not that was machine learning, whether or not that was neural networks. We're now in that next stage of generative AI capability, but it brings it right back to that fundamental question of what can it actually achieve. And so much of that, as you were pointing out, is a matter of making sure that we've got the right data. The data that we have has sufficient context so that we can do association and correlation and actually start to put some of these puzzle pieces together. And I think it's interesting that agentic applications may be a piece in which we can start to take that next step of saying, well, if we don't have the data, the agent can actually go figure out where it is, go find it, go sort that out. Maybe that starts to complete some of that puzzle and maybe take us to some of those next steps.
Yeah, some of it's absolutely essential. We have to move in this direction, and security operations is one of the high-profile use cases for agentic workflows. I mean, a lot of what we've seen has been directly facing consumers in a lot of cases. The examples we saw, OpenAI Operator, initially, some very straightforward tasks, booking, buying tickets, booking a flight, things like that. So there's still that idea that agents can operate with a fair degree of autonomy, that they can model human reasoning up to a point. I say that a little guardedly because there's been a lot of discussion around that very aspect of agentic functionality, and they can use tools. So elaborating on that to optimizing security operations is very much in view. It will be a very active aspect of the managed services and MDR space in the not too distant future.
Well, we're seeing some of the hyperscale providers who have got security capabilities wrapped around it start to leverage agents for augmentation of some of the services that they've got. It seems like maybe that's that initial path of being able to now have task-specific agent activities, give me the summary, roll up a lot of the data, give me the background for why you have made some assumptions. Those kinds of things from the assistive perspective seem like those are first steps that can be useful and actually get some first stage traction.
Yeah, there's a spectrum from, generative assistants to agents that are agentic assistants, assistant individual, to agentic AI as an architectural concept. And, it's kind of gray. The boundaries between each of these are not always clear and distinct. In fact, there's been, 40 plus years of research into agentic AI, specifically going back well before what we've seen more recently in generative AI per se. But we're seeing, the merger of those two threads of innovation around AI. And so those boundaries are indistinct at this point. But as they evolve, we're starting to see more complex workflows, more architectural approaches to this will emerge. And we'll definitely see those in security operations. I think over the next few months, are going to be very active with that in this space.
Well, we can certainly use the help. Well, and I guess we'll have to see where that shakes out. Certainly a lot more to go, but this has been great to get some background into where we sit with this. I guess more to come, maybe a further discussion on service as software as we look a little further ahead. But thank you both for being back on the podcast. This has been great.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure, Eric. Thanks.
But that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Faran Miadashian, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Please join us for our next episode, where we'll be talking about advertising in tech and tech advertising. And we'll be digging into that. Hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.